Love is not just for this world. If you want to discover feelings that transcend boundaries, subscribe now. The battlefield stretched endlessly, a wasteland of shattered metal and scorched earth. Smoke curled in the fractured sky, thick and choking, carrying the acrid scent of burning wreckage and something far worse, the stench of death. Zyon moved through the devastation with practiced efficiency, stepping over twisted bodies, both human and mechanical, his rifle held steady in his grip. The weight of it was familiar, grounding. The mission had been straightforward: neutralize hostiles, secure the perimeter, extract. Another nameless war on another nameless world. But war was never simple. He had stopped believing in causes a long time ago. Soldiers fought for flags, politicians fought for power, but mercenaries like him, they fought for the highest bidder. And yet, as he advanced through the ruin, something gnawed at him, a tension in the air, a lingering sense that this battle had not been what it seemed. The enemy had fought too desperately, too erratically, as if protecting something beyond mere territory. A sound broke through the distant echoes of war. Soft, fragile, a whimper against the chaos. Zyon turned sharply, rifle raised, eyes scanning the rubble. Movement flickered beneath the collapsed frame of a transport shuttle. Something small, not a soldier. He advanced, bootsteps crunching over broken glass and spent shells, breath measured, gaze sharp. A survivor? A liability? Then he saw it. A child. Zyon froze. The creature before him was unlike anything he had encountered in all his years of war. Small and delicate, its limbs thin, its skin the color of storm-washed stone. The child's head was slightly too large for its frail frame, its violet eyes wide and luminous, shimmering with something between terror and recognition. It clutched its knees, trembling, bare feet smeared with dust and dry blood. The remnants of a simple tunic clung to its tiny body, torn and stained with battle's filth. Its breathing came in short, panicked gasps, shoulders shaking with exhaustion. But what unsettled Zyon most wasn't its appearance or even its condition. It was the way the child looked at him, not with fear, with familiarity. Then, in a voice so soft it barely reached him, the child whispered a single word. "Baba." Zyon's grip on his rifle tightened. A flicker of something unexpected, something dangerously close to emotion, uncoiled in his chest. His mind scrambled for logic. He didn't know this child. He had never set foot on this world before today. And yet, the way it looked at him, the way it spoke, as if it knew him. A trick of desperation, he reasoned. A survival instinct, clinging to the first living thing it saw. He should leave. The mission was over. His evac was waiting. He had no obligation to this child, no reason to take on dead weight. And yet, he didn't move. The child's breath hitched, its small hands gripping the fabric of its tattered tunic as its gaze pleaded silently. "Baba, beni bırakma." A tremor ran through Zyon's chest, something unfamiliar and unwelcome. He had seen orphaned children before. He had walked past them, turned away from their cries, reminded himself that mercy had no place in war. And yet, something about this one. He exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "I'm not your father," he muttered, voice rough. The child didn't respond, didn't flinch. It simply continued to stare at him with those impossibly large eyes, as if waiting for him to understand something he could not yet grasp. Zyon ran a hand over his face, cursing under his breath. He was wasting time. His squad would be leaving without him soon. "Can you walk?" he asked. The child hesitated, then gave a small, uncertain nod. Its limbs trembled as it tried to push itself up. It was exhausted, malnourished. It wouldn't make it far. Zyon sighed. Against every instinct, against every hardened rule he had lived by, he crouched down and extended a hand. The child hesitated only a moment before its small fingers curled around his. The grip was weak, but desperate. He pulled the child up, steadying it as it swayed. A distant explosion rumbled through the wreckage, sending a pulse of urgency through Zyon's veins. He turned his gaze skyward. Smoke billowed in the distance. The rhythmic hum of approaching engines vibrated through the ground. Time had run out. Without another thought, he scooped the child into his arms. It clung to him instinctively, small hands gripping the fabric of his vest as he moved, his strides swift and precise. He navigated the labyrinth of destruction with ease, boots kicking up dust as he pressed toward the extraction point. His comm crackled. "Zyon, what the hell is taking you so long?" The voice of his squad leader, sharp with impatience. Zyon clenched his jaw. "Change of plans," he muttered. A beat of silence. "Then what did you do?" He didn't answer. The extraction ship loomed ahead, ramp lowered, engines warming. He bounded up the incline, thrusters kicking up dust as the ship prepared to lift off. The moment his boots hit the deck, the doors sealed shut. The child exhaled against his chest, a soft, exhausted sound, but didn't let go. "Zyon." The squad leader's words died as his gaze landed on the small figure in Zyon's arms. His face paled. Zyon set the child down gently. "Found him out there," he said, voice steady but guarded. "Couldn't leave him." A charged silence settled over the cabin. His squad had seen him do ruthless things, had watched him execute enemies without hesitation. They had never seen him do this. The leader's throat bobbed as he swallowed hard. His gaze flickered between Zyon and the child. "You don't know what you just did?" he said finally, voice hollow. Zyon frowned. "What are you talking about?" The leader inhaled sharply, as if steadying himself. When he spoke again, it was barely above a whisper. "That's not just any kid." He looked at the child again, at the delicate frame, the strange violet eyes that seemed far too knowing for their age. "That," the leader continued, voice tight with something that sounded dangerously close to fear, "is the heir to the Veyron Empire." The ship drifted through the void, its course no longer following the intended trajectory. Zyon sat in the dim glow of the cabin, arms crossed, gaze locked on the child across from him. The hum of the engine, steady and rhythmic, had always been a comforting constant in his life, a background noise that signified motion, escape, survival. But now it felt different, as if the entire ship carried an unspoken tension, the weight of an action that could not be undone. Rillick sat on the metal bench, small hands folded neatly in his lap, his violet eyes drifting between Zyon and Rinza with a quiet intensity. He wasn't squirming, wasn't fidgeting, wasn't even crying. He just watched, not in fear, not in confusion, but with an unsettling patience, as though he had already thought through every possibility of what would happen next and simply awaited confirmation. Zyon had seen war-orphaned children before. He had seen them scream, collapse, clutch at their dead parents, beg for help or vengeance. Rillick did none of these things, and that was the most unnerving part of all. Across from him, Rinza exhaled sharply and leaned forward, forearms resting on his knees, his voice a controlled growl. "Do you have any idea what you just did?" Zyon didn't answer right away. He let the words settle in the space between them, weighing them against the part of him that had already replayed every decision in his head. "I saved a kid," he said finally. Rinza's jaw tightened. "You picked up an Imperial heir in the middle of a war zone. Do you understand what that means?" Zyon barely flicked his gaze toward him. That someone left him there to die. Rinza's lips pressed into a thin line, frustration flickering behind his eyes. The Veyron Empire doesn't just misplace their royal blood. If he was left behind, it was intentional. And the moment they realize he's missing, every tracker, every bounty hunter, and every Imperial warship in range is going to be looking for him. Looking for us. Zyon shifted his focus back to Rillick. The boy had yet to speak since they left the battlefield, but his eyes told a different story. He wasn't confused by what was happening. He understood exactly what was at stake. Zyon leaned forward slightly. "Rillick." The name felt strange in his mouth, like something half-remembered. The boy's head lifted, his expression unreadable. "How did you end up there?" A long pause stretched between them. The ship's hum filled the silence, pulsing like a second heartbeat. "They wanted me to die," Rillick finally said, his voice soft but unwavering. Zyon felt something cold settle in his chest. "Who?" Rinza asked. The boy's fingers curled against his knees, knuckles white. "My uncle." Rinza muttered a curse under his breath. Zyon's frown deepened. He wasn't an expert in Veyron politics, but even he knew what that meant. The Emperor's brother? Zyon pressed. Rillick gave the barest nod. And with that, the final piece of the puzzle snapped into place. The Empire's line of succession had always been absolute. There were no elections, no shifting of power through political maneuvering. The Emperor's heir ruled next, unless there was no heir to rule. If Rillick's uncle had tried to have him killed, it meant only one thing. The Emperor was dead. "We need to land," Rinza said suddenly, pushing to his feet. His voice had lost its anger, replaced by something colder. Calculated. Zyon narrowed his eyes. "Why?" Rinza turned to face him fully, his tone clipped. "Because we're sitting in a flying beacon with a target painted on our backs. The moment the Vayrons realize their heir is missing, they'll start scanning for any ship that left that battlefield. We need to disappear before they do." Zyon clenched his jaw, thinking. Rillick still sat motionless, hands folded, gaze never wavering. As if he had known, from the moment Zyon had picked him up, that this was inevitable. "Where do we go?" Zyon asked. Rinza's lips pressed into a thin line. "Somewhere they won't think to look for a royal." Zyon considered their options. Imperial control planets were out of the question. Major trade hubs were too risky, too many checkpoints, too many eyes. They needed somewhere remote, somewhere unaligned, somewhere that didn't ask questions. Then it hit him. Sable's End. Rinza shot him a look. "You want to hide in a scavenger colony?" Zyon shrugged. "They don't owe loyalty to anyone, and they don't ask where you came from. We can lay low, figure out our next move." Rinza exhaled through his nose, but didn't argue. "Fine, but if they're already tracking us, we won't get the chance." Zyon turned toward the cockpit, switching on the intercom. "Change course. We're going dark." As the ship veered off its intended path, Rillick finally spoke again, his voice barely above a whisper. "You shouldn't have taken me." Zyon studied the boy's face. "Why?" Rillick met his gaze, something old and knowing in those violet eyes. "Because now they'll come for you too." A proximity alarm blared through the ship. Rinza whipped around toward the control panel, his fingers flying over the screen. "Damn it," he hissed. "We've got company." Zyon moved to his side, eyes scanning the display. A set of red blips lit up the screen, closing in fast. "They already found us," Rinza muttered. Zion's hands curled into fists. He looked back at Rillick, who still sat perfectly still. "They were never going to stop looking," the boy murmured. Zyon exhaled sharply, pulse quickening. The time for planning was over. They were out of time. The proximity alarm screamed through the ship, a high, grating wail that sent adrenaline surging through Zion's veins. He didn't hesitate. His boots struck the metal floor in quick, determined strides as he moved toward the cockpit, already calculating their odds. The control panel glowed with a web of red warnings, 3 incoming signals blinking in relentless pursuit. "How bad?" he asked, voice clipped. Rinza's hands danced across the controls, scanning the enemy ships with the precision of a man who had survived one too many close calls. His expression was grim. 3 pursuit-class interceptors. Sleek. Fast. Definitely private contractors. "They're not here to destroy us." His voice dropped slightly. "They want us alive." That was worse. Zyon had spent enough years in this business to know that a clean death was mercy. Whatever these people wanted, it wouldn't be merciful. He turned, gaze landing on the boy. Rillick had not moved. He sat with the same eerie stillness he had carried since the moment Zyon had pulled him from the battlefield. There was no fear in him, only quiet acceptance. It wasn't the blank emptiness of shock. It was something else. Zion's grip tightened on the back of the pilot's chair. "They'll try to board us." Rillick's violet eyes met his. "They won't stop." The certainty in his voice sent an uneasy ripple down Zion's spine. He had seen hardened soldiers break under pressure, seen them shake and curse when death loomed too close. But Rillick wasn't shaking. He wasn't pleading. He was waiting. Zyon hated that. "We're not making it to Sables, in with them on our tail," Rinza muttered. "We need to fight." Zion's fingers tapped against his belt as his mind worked through their options. Their ship wasn't designed for combat, but it was fast, faster than most interceptors if pushed to its limit. "No," he said. "We lose them in the Scourge Belt." Rinza stiffened. Are you out of your damn mind? That place eats ships alive. Zyon held his gaze. And that's why they won't follow us. Rinza hesitated, then swore under his breath. Or we don't make it out either. Zyon shrugged. Better odds than surrendering. The ship banked hard as Rinza slammed the throttle forward, angling their course toward the swirling chaos ahead. The Scourge belt loomed in the distance, a graveyard of shattered asteroids and drifting wreckage, caught in an endless dance of destruction. Half of those ships had belonged to fools who thought they could navigate it. The other half had been chased into it just like them. Behind them, the three pursuers adjusted course. They're following Rinza a bit out. Good, Zyon said, strapping himself in. Let's see if they're stupid enough to keep up. The ship plunged into the belt. Fragments of metal and rock spun wildly, gravity distortions pulling in unpredictable directions. The dying light of a distant star cast eerie shadows over the wreckage, turning the debris field into something resembling the bones of long-dead giants. Rinza gripped the controls with white-knuckled focus. Tell me you have an actual plan beyond hope they crash first. Zyon smirked. You doubt my piloting? Yes. Fair enough. Zyon ignored him, watching the enemy ships on the scanner. They hesitated at the edge of the field, calculating. Then slowly they advanced. Arrogant, Zyon murmured. They think their tech makes them untouchable. They might be right, Rinza muttered, jerking the ship hard to avoid a spiraling chunk of debris. Zyon leaned forward, watching the scanner. Wait for it. The lead ship picked up speed, weaving through the debris with expert precision. It had better stabilizers, more advanced thrusters. But Zyon wasn't counting on brute force. He was counting on physics. The gravity well hit without warning. For half a second, the lead ship shuddered, caught in the unseen pull. Engines flared, the pilot struggling against the distortion. Then, in a violent lurch, the ship twisted off course, slamming into a drifting asteroid the size of a battleship. The impact tore through its hull, sending debris scattering like shattered glass. The explosion flared bright, then vanished into the void. Zyon exhaled through his nose. One down. The other two hesitated, adjusting their tactics. They wouldn't make the same mistake. Zyon turned to Rillick. You know these ships. Who sent them? Rillick studied the display, his gaze flickering across the ship markings. Not my uncle. Zion's frown deepened. That complicated things. Then who? Rillick didn't answer immediately. His lips pressed together, his fingers tightening slightly against the armrest. Someone worse. Before Zyon could press him, Rinza jerked the ship sideways, barely avoiding another gravitational surge. The second pursuer wasn't as lucky. It clipped a rogue chunk of wreckage, sending it into an uncontrollable spiral. For a moment, it looked as if the pilot would regain control. Then the ship was gone, swallowed whole by the shifting debris. Two, Zyon murmured. The third ship hung back, no longer reckless. It had learned from the others. That one's not leaving, Rinza muttered. They'll shadow us until we clear the belt, then call for reinforcements. Zyon knew he was right. They had forced their enemy into caution, but caution wasn't retreat. Then Rillick moved. It was a small shift, a deliberate one. He stood, stepping forward, his small frame barely reacting to the ship's motion. His gaze settled on the scanner, studying the lone ship like it was a puzzle he had already solved. Then, quietly, he said, "Open a channel." Rinza shot Zyon a sharp look. "What?" Zyon didn't take his eyes off the boy. "You know who's on that ship?" Rillick inclined his head slightly. "I know what they want." Zyon exhaled, then flipped the switch. Static crackled through the cabin before a voice filled the space. "You have something that doesn't belong to you. Smooth. Precise. Female. Not imperial. Not military. Something else." Zyon didn't flinch. "So do a lot of people. Be specific." A soft chuckle. "I'd rather not. You know what I want." Zion's gaze flicked to Rillick. The boy was composed, but something in his eyes had changed. Not fear. Not surprise. Recognition. "I don't like handing over strays," Zyon said evenly. "You misunderstand." The voice held no urgency, no frustration. Only certainty. I don't need you to give him to me. I only need you to wait. A chill coiled in Zion's gut. Rilek exhaled softly. She's not lying. Rinza's fingers hovered over the controls. Who the hell is this? The voice paused, then spoke with quiet amusement. Someone who's been looking for him longer than you have. Zion's fingers curled against his belt. He had expected bounty hunters, imperial assassins, a desperate uncle trying to eliminate a loose end. But this was something else entirely. He glanced at Rilek. The boy still wasn't afraid. And that was the most unnerving part of all. The silence that followed the woman's words was heavier than the vacuum outside the ship. Zyon sat motionless, fingers still curled near the console, his mind working through the implications of her calm certainty. Someone who had been looking for Rilek longer than they had. Someone who knew exactly where to find them. Someone who wasn't afraid. That, more than anything, made his stomach twist. Rinza shifted uncomfortably beside him, his hand hovering near the thruster controls. The tension in his shoulders was obvious, but he didn't speak. It was rare to see him without a quick retort, but this was different. This wasn't some petty skirmish or routine escape. This was something older, something calculated. Zyon exhaled sharply, forcing himself to remain steady. You talk like I should know you. The woman's voice carried a quiet amusement. Oh, you do. Maybe not by name, but by consequence. Zyon hated games. He could hear it in her tone, the subtle inflection, the deliberate patience. She was in control, and she knew it. Rilek, standing eerily still near the console, finally spoke. You're with the Hand. Zion's fingers tightened. The Hand. It wasn't a military faction. It wasn't the Empire's secret police. It was something far worse. An organization that didn't officially exist, but whose reach had been whispered about in dark corners of the galaxy. The Hand didn't follow laws. They enforced their own. Assassinations, coups, silent wars fought behind closed doors, shifting the fate of planets without ever firing a single public shot. Zyon had never crossed them directly. He had made sure of that. But he had heard stories, mercenaries disappearing overnight, whole dynasties crumbling with no official record of wrongdoing. He had spent his life avoiding entanglements like this. Yet here he was. The woman chuckled softly. Smart boy. Zion's grip on the edge of the console was tight enough to turn his knuckles white. Why is the Hand interested in a kid? A brief pause. You already know the answer. Zyon exchanged a look with Rinza, who shook his head subtly. Don't push. Not yet. He turned back to the display. If you wanted to kill him, you wouldn't have sent those bounty ships. You wouldn't be talking to me now. So what do you actually want? Another pause. Then, you're right. His uncle wants him dead. We don't. Zyon frowned. That was unexpected. You don't work for the Empire, he said carefully. You don't take sides. We don't take visible sides, she corrected. But balance must be maintained. Rilek's uncle isn't interested in ruling. He's interested in purging. Do you know what happens when a leader consolidates power too quickly? Zyon did. It created instability, desperation. It left fractures for enemies to slip through, gave rise to civil wars that rippled through systems like wildfire. If the Hand was involved, that meant this wasn't just about imperial succession. This was about control. You need him alive, Zyon said. Yes. Zion's pulse beat against his temple. That changed everything. Then why chase us? Rinza cut in. Why send killers after a kid you need alive? A test, the woman said smoothly. For him. For you. Zyon felt his patience wearing thin. And you passed, she said simply. Which means you now have a choice. Zyon didn't respond. He already knew what was coming. We can offer you protection, the woman continued. Resources. Safe passage. The Empire is already hunting you. With us, you'd be more than ghosts. You'd be untouchable. Zyon let the words settle, let them twist and turn in his mind. The Hand didn't make casual offers. If they were willing to extend their reach to him, it wasn't generosity. It was investment. Rilek, still watching the screen, spoke before Zyon could. And if we refuse? The woman sighed, as if mildly disappointed. Then we let the Empire take you. We won't stop them. We'll simply wait for the next opportunity. Zion's jaw clenched. She was telling the truth. The Hand never forced compliance. They simply made the alternative worse. Give us time, Zyon said finally. A pause. Then one cycle. A single planetary rotation. Not long. We'll find you, the woman said, and the channel went dead. For a long moment, none of them moved. The ship continued its course through the Scourge Belt, the distant wreckage turning in slow, silent spirals. Then Rinza swore under his breath. I hate this. Zyon leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. You're not the only one. Rillick finally looked away from the display, his expression unreadable. They won't stop. Zyon studied him. There was no fear in his voice, no uncertainty, just the weight of a truth he had carried far longer than he should have. Zyon ran a hand over his face, exhaustion creeping into his bones. He had spent his life avoiding politics, avoiding the invisible wars fought behind power and secrecy. And yet, somehow, he had stumbled straight into the center of one. He looked at the boy, a child but not, an heir but not, a survivor. Zyon didn't believe in fate, but if he did, he might have thought it had a sick sense of humor. Change of plans, he muttered. We're not going to Sable's End. Rinza frowned. Then where? Zion's gaze flicked to the navigation screen. He didn't know the full picture yet, but he knew one thing for certain. If the Hand wanted to control this war, then their only chance of surviving it was to find the people willing to break their rules. He set the coordinates. Somewhere the Hand doesn't own. The ship cut through the darkness like a silent predator, slipping out of the Scourge Belt's tangled wreckage and into the cold, open void beyond. Zyon leaned against the bulkhead, arms crossed, watching the distant glow of dying stars flicker through the viewport. The weight of the last hour pressed against his mind, a weight heavier than the ship's failing gravity stabilizers. They had survived, but survival wasn't victory. Behind him, Rinza was still at the controls, his posture tense, eyes flicking between the monitors as if expecting the Hand's shadow to reappear at any moment. The woman's voice still lingered in the air, her certainty wrapping around them like a noose. One cycle. That was all they had before the Hand came back to collect. Rillick sat near the navigation panel, small hands folded in his lap. He hadn't spoken since the transmission ended. He didn't need to. The silence between them was heavy with the understanding that none of them had a choice in what came next. Zyon exhaled sharply, pushing off the bulkhead. We need to refuel, and we need answers. Rinza didn't turn from the controls. Where are we going? Zion's gaze flicked to the navigation screen. Velmara. Rinza let out a low curse. You want to run to a lawless moon while every bounty hunter in the sector is probably searching for us. Zyon gave him a flat look. Do you have a better idea? Rinza clenched his jaw but said nothing. Velmara wasn't a safe haven, but that was precisely what made it useful. A rogue moon orbiting a dying gas giant, it had become a sanctuary for the unwanted, the exiled, the hunted, the ones too dangerous to be allowed anywhere else. Smugglers and warlords ruled it in uneasy truces, and information could be bought if you knew where to look. Zyon knew exactly where to look. The ship broke into the outer edges of the Velmaran system, and the scanners immediately flared red. We've got company, Rinza muttered. Zyon moved to the co-pilot's seat, scanning the incoming signatures. Local enforcers? Rinza shook his head. No, freelancers. Small time, but they'll still shoot if we give them a reason. Zyon keyed the comms. Velmara Control. This is the freighter Harrow, requesting clearance for docking. The response was static-laced, but a voice eventually crackled through. Landing fee is 10,000. Zyon didn't blink. 5. Laughter. 7. And we don't check your cargo. Zion's fingers hovered over the controls. Deal. The comm cut out, and the ship's guidance system lit up with a landing path. Rinza shook his head. You just paid a month's worth of fuel for the privilege of being robbed on the ground. Zyon smirked. Not if we get what we came for first. The ship settled into the docking bay with a dull hiss. The moment the engines powered down, Zyon rose. Stay with the ship, he told Rinza. If something goes wrong, take off without us. Rinza didn't argue. Zyon turned to Rillick. We're going to see someone. Stay close. Don't talk unless I tell you to. Rillick met his gaze without hesitation. I understand. Zyon wasn't sure if that reassured him or unsettled him further. They stepped onto the docking platform, the air thick with the scent of burning fuel and damp metal. Vilmara's capital was a sprawling mess of interconnected platforms, stacked haphazardly atop one another like a city built on the bones of 1,000 failed civilizations. Neon signs flickered between darkened alleys, promising illicit trades and pleasures best left undiscovered. Zyon navigated through the crowd with practiced ease, keeping one hand near his belt, the other resting lightly on Rillick's shoulder. The boy moved without hesitation, his small frame slipping between the chaos like he belonged. Zyon noted that. They stopped outside a rusted-out dive bar wedged between two towering storage complexes. The sign above the door flickered weakly, the Red Wake. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of spilled liquor and bad decisions. The patrons barely glanced up as Zyon stepped through the threshold, but a few lingered a second too long on Rillick. Zyon didn't slow. He moved straight to the back to a booth half hidden in shadows. The woman sitting there didn't look up. Zyon. Her voice was a slow drawl, lazy but edged with something sharp. You look worse than usual. Zyon slid into the seat across from her, Rillick settling beside him. That's because I've had a long week. She finally looked up. Her eyes flicked to Rillick. Huh. Zyon leaned forward. I need information. She smirked. Everyone does. On the hand. That wiped the amusement from her face. She studied him for a moment, then reached for her drink. Why would you be asking about them? Because they're asking about us. The woman set the glass down carefully. You're either incredibly unlucky or incredibly stupid. Zyon let the silence answer for him. She sighed. The hand doesn't chase ghosts. They don't hunt unless they're sure of a target. They're sure of this one. He nodded toward Rillick. The woman stared at the boy for a long moment, then let out another sigh. I don't deal in their business. No one does. You deal in everything, Zyon countered, and you don't turn down credits. A slow smirk. True. Zyon placed a small data chip on the table. I need to know what they want with him, and I need it fast. She took the chip, inspecting it before tucking it away. Come back in an hour. Zyon nodded and stood, pulling Rillick with him. He could feel the weight of eyes on them as they left. Back outside, the air was colder, the night pressing in tighter. Rillick finally spoke. She's afraid of them. Zyon glanced at him. Everyone is. The boy was quiet for a moment, then said, And you? Zyon didn't answer, but the truth sat heavy in his chest. Yes, he was afraid, because for the first time in a long time, he wasn't sure how this ended. The air in the Red Wake had thickened since Zyon left. When he and Rillick returned an hour later, the bar was quieter, conversations hushed. The weight of unspoken warnings pressed against them, coiling through the room like smoke. She was still there, seated at the same booth, her expression unreadable. Zyon slid into the seat across from her, without hesitation, Rillick settling beside him. The woman toyed with the rim of her glass before speaking. You've kicked a nest you don't understand. Zyon leaned forward, arms resting on the table. Then explain it to me. She studied him for a long moment, then exhaled, reaching into her jacket. A small hollow pad clattered onto the table. She tapped its surface, and a display flickered to life. Strings of data scrolled rapidly, symbols and names appearing for mere seconds before shifting again. The hand doesn't just manipulate power, she murmured. They curate it. Zyon's eyes tracked the data, scanning the brief flashes of intercepted transmissions, imperial records, and classified directives. All revolving around one name, Rillick. They weren't sent to kill him, the woman continued. Not at first. His uncle's orders were clear. Eliminate the heir. Ensure no claim to the throne remains. But the hand. She tapped the pad, freezing an image in place. They had a different plan. Zyon's gaze locked on the screen. It was a document, an encrypted directive. The words chilled him. Acquisition, not termination. Initiate contingency protocol. His stomach twisted. He had expected assassination orders, a clean-cut coup. But this wasn't about removing a threat. It was about shaping one. They wanted to take him, he muttered. The woman nodded. Not just take. Train. Mold. The hand doesn't create leaders. They build weapons disguised as them. Zyon looked at Rillick, but the boy wasn't surprised. He had known, maybe not the details, but the shape of it. He had spent his life waiting to be used. The woman closed the hollow pad and leaned back. You have two choices. Zyon already knew what they were. He could run, disappear into the farthest reaches of space, spend the rest of his days looking over his shoulder, waiting for the inevitable. Or he could end it. Here, now. Where's the hand's closest operation? He asked. The woman's brow lifted. Bold. Necessary. She studied him again, as if measuring the weight of his conviction. Then, with a slow nod, she slid a small chip across the table. There's a relay station outside this system. Unmarked, unregistered, but it's where their data flows through. Zyon picked up the chip, turning it between his fingers. And the woman I spoke to? She won't be there, the woman said. But her orders will. Rillick shifted beside him. You're going after them. It wasn't a question. Zyon met the boy's gaze. I won't let them take you. For the first time, something flickered in Rillick's expression. Not fear, not calculation. Something softer. Zyon pocketed the chip. Let's go. They left the red wake without looking back. The trip to the relay station was fast, too fast for comfort. The station itself drifted in the void like a forgotten relic. No lights, no transmissions. Rinza scowled at the readings. It's too quiet. Zyon checked his weapons. Then let's make some noise. They docked with caution. The airlock hissed open to a station that smelled of stale air and dying circuitry. Inside, the corridors stretched in eerie silence, flickering emergency lights, casting long shadows. Zyon moved quickly, Rillick at his side, Rinza covering their flank. The control room was near the core. If the hand's directives were stored anywhere, it would be there. They reached the terminal without resistance. Zyon accessed the system, slotting in the chip. The data flood was instant. Encrypted logs, movement patterns, operational commands. And then he found it. Rinza swore. That's their next target. Zyon finished, reading the coordinates. Not them. Not Rillick. The Empire itself. They're not working for his uncle, Zyon realized. They're working past him. The hand had never been backing the new emperor. They were orchestrating his downfall. A voice crackled through the station speakers. You're quick, the woman from before mused. But not quick enough. Zyon turned, heart hammering. Rillick stared at the speakers. His expression didn't shift. They're here. The station shuddered. A docking clamp engaged. The airlock hissed. They were no longer alone. Zyon drew his weapon. No more running. This ended now.